and some interesting theology. Again, what's the dominant theme here in Samuel? No, not David. 2 Samuel focuses on David. God's mediated rule. God's mediated rule. You know, that God is sovereignly in control of Israel's history, even as He mediates His rule through individuals. First Samuel, then Saul, and now we'll see David. And this really, in some ways, the book of Samuel explains the significance of what was said in Judges. In those days, there was no king. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now we see God bringing in kings and the role of the king in bringing in righteousness and bringing moral and spiritual stability. In the book of Kings, you see a nation's spiritual condition really did reside within the heart of the king and the influence that a king had. Now, we'd seen God's mediated rule through Samuel, the prophet, and through him they conquered Philistines even. Yeah, probably you could say Samuel began to accomplish those things that Samson started. He didn't really accomplish it. Samson sort of initiated it. Samuel continued it. Saul continued it, the conquest of the Philistines. But ultimately, David brought it to completion. And that this was a part of God's purpose behind them all in that. We saw Saul eliminate himself from being God's choice by his sin. And really, I would say this, that a key element in Saul's sin is not that he sinned, but that he didn't repent. Whereas we'll see that David does sin, but he also repents. And that makes David a man after God's own heart. And what makes him a man after God's own heart is that he is soft before him. So continuing into 2 Samuel, of course, 1 Samuel ends, and remember, in the Hebrew Bible, there was no break. So it just moves on forward from Saul's death in battle. And so now, in these first few chapters, we have the transition into the new kingdom. And you have a situation in chapter 1 where David gets word of Saul and Jonathan's death, and he honors them. Now, this is a man who's been trying to kill him for 27 years. Who took his wife and gave her to somebody else. And who was a poor leader. He's murdered priests. Yet, David honors him, and the text notes that people notice that. One of the principles you see in this, it's not a direct teaching of the text, but you see that, and that is, in the law, God did command that we should never rejoice over the punishment of our enemies. In fact, He said, if you do that, then I'll give you their punishment instead of them. And Jesus taught that principle too. And David lived it out. Now, in chapter 2, of course, David is crowned the king of Judah, but the northern tribes go with Ishbosheth. And their general, Abner, is tied in. Who is Abner? Besides the general of the north, he is a cousin of Saul's. So he's an uncle of Ishbosheth, in a sense, or a relative. And Ishbosheth is the last of Saul's direct sons who would have a claim to the throne. He's got other sons through concubines and things, but they wouldn't be considered legitimate heirs. And so he's the heir apparent. Abner, of course, brings him to the throne, but really, Abner's just keeping himself in power, because Abner is the real power behind the throne. Ishbosheth apparently is a weak person. He wasn't strong enough to go into battle. Otherwise, he'd have died with his dad in battle. But then you have this revolt that occurs, or this civil war that occurs. And this is one of those interesting events where the two generals, Joab and Abner, get together. They sit down and have a meal together before the battle. And they select 12 young men from each army who then have this contest. They grab each other by the beard and stab each other to death. And you go, how could somebody do that? Well, that's the world they live in. Because dying was not a bad thing in their world. In fact, it was an honorable way to go. And also, one of the characteristics of the military is, in fact, why the military likes single men, is because single men will go on suicide missions. Married men won't. And in fact, it was a fascinating thing that they found in the Navy. When Navy ships got sunk and men had to tread water for several days, waiting for help to come, all these old, pot-bellied married men would still be there treading water, and all these young, strapping single guys would have drowned because they'd give up. But them married men, they'd never give up. They would just keep treading and treading and treading because they were going to go home to mom. They were going to go home to their kids. And so young men do it. And they do this, and they have the battle, and of course, David's men win, and so you have the successful division of the country for a time. But in God's perspective, David is the legitimate heir. Now, David actually ends up waiting 7 years to unite the kingdom. So Ishbosheth is on the scene for 7 more years, and David patiently waits for God's timing. And God is patient in bringing it together. And so, chapter 3, you have a situation where Abner comes to hand over the kingdom, and Joab assassinates him, murders him. Now, Joab might argue, what's blood right? But Abner, when he killed Joab's brother in battle, it was a legitimate combat casualty. It did not give Joab the right of next of kin blood right, because it was fair combat. But they knew each other. I mean, even when Abner killed Joab's brother, he talked to him in the process, tried to talk him out of it. Said, kill one of my other guys and take his stuff. And you had the ego. And so he goes ahead and kills him. And Joab, of course, avenges it. But also there's a good possibility, the text says clearly he was avenging his brother, but there's some raise the possibility, I wouldn't agree with it, that what Joab was really afraid of is that Abner would become David's general and would supplant him, so he takes him out. The text doesn't indicate that. The text indicates it's just pure revenge. Revenge for the death of his brother. Now, this section ends, of course, with Ishbosheth being assassinated, and his assassins cut his head off and bring it as proof to David that he's dead. And yet David then executes them. Why? Because Ishbosheth is not God's anointed. And it certainly helps David out.
He's still king of the northern tribe.
Yeah, he's still king, and you're supposed to treat your king with respect. Basically, David's position is the man's going to die, let him die an honorable death in battle. And you should be loyal to your king. There was treason on their part. So, for his sake, he executes him. And again, people respond by saying, wow, wise decision. And this is one of the valuable things with David. You see, just like with Solomon later on, you see with David that early on in his reign, he makes a lot of very wise decisions. And God blesses him through this. And you see the hand of God on his reign. Now we move to this into the next major section, which is David's reign prior to his sin with Bathsheba. And really the sin with Bathsheba is a turning point in David's reign. And you can divide his reign into 2 parts. The good side and the bad side. The time when everything was working well and the time when nothing seemed to be working well. And it's that sin. Now, in that context, you begin, of course, in chapter 5, by his uniting the nation after Ishbosheth dies, his conquest of Jerusalem, and then his defeat of the Philistines. He finally brings to completion what was really started by Samson, continued by Samuel, supposed to be done by Saul, but now completed by David, with the defeat of the Philistines in the valley of Rephaim. And how does he defeat them? What's the key to his success? Well, God gives them a battle strategy through the Urim and the Thummim. David consults the priest, the Urim and the Thummim. And again, the way that worked is you'd ask basically yes, no questions. And the priest shakes his little pouch and brings out one of the two stones. One's black, one's white, or something like that. And depending on which one is a yes or no answer. And from that, then you make your strategy. And that's how God responds.
That's what you think it is, a pouch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
not something on the breastplate.
Well, it's on the breastplate, but it's a pouch in the breastplate.
Okay.
You know, it was a pocket in it that these two things were put in. And remember when Saul consulted through the priest, God refused to answer him with the Urim and the Thummim. He refused to answer him with any prophets. He shut Saul. So in contrast to Saul now, you have David, God not only communicating with him, but where Saul, God was silent and it led to his death and defeat in battle, with David, God communicates and it leads to victory. And so there's a big contrast there. But you see the blessing of God on David, God's anointed. And he begins his reign with these victories. Now, why do the Philistines come and attack? Because they fear David. And they want to take him out early on. And yet, he defeats them soundly. Now, we also have the comment about the King Hiram of Tyre and all the dealings he had with David. At this point, it's commented on in detail a little later. And you see that God is blessing them from every direction. Now, in chapter 6, they go to bring the ark to Jerusalem. And it fails. Why? What is the cause of the failure?
Didn't follow the law.
Right. Loaded him on a cart, didn't follow the Mosaic law, didn't do it God's way. And it cost Uzzah his life. He did it the world's way. Did it out of ignorance. Now, here's an important thing to see. Was David's motives good? They really were. He was bringing the ark to Jerusalem, which was the site that God was choosing for the place for his temple to be. He wanted God's glory. He also wanted Jerusalem to be blessed. Was he sincere? Yeah, he was very sincere. And yet God didn't bless it because he wasn't doing it God's way.
Now you say it was out of ignorance. Does the text really strongly indicate that, or is it more just we know his character, we know he wouldn't...
Yeah, we know his character. Yeah,
so it's not saying that...
It had to be out of ignorance. And in fact, I would guess this, that they went back, read the scriptures, figured out the way it's supposed to be done, and that's why they did it the right way the next time. There's an implication in the text, though not a direct one. Because the text then describes, the fact that they did then do it in accordance with the law. So that would indicate that, they hadn't consulted. And the priests hadn't either.
Well, you probably said the same thing about Uzzah, too. He did it out of ignorance.
That's right. Yeah, he did it out of ignorance.
Yeah,
he was very sincere. And sincerity didn't save his life. What was that?
Where in the law does it... Are we specifically saying that the ark has to be brought to Jerusalem in a certain way, and that's in the law?
No, actually, the ark was never to be transported on anything except the shoulders of the priests.
Okay, so it's just the transportation of it, not
The
necessarily
transportation of it.
that it's going to Jerusalem.
No.
Got it.
Anytime it was moved, it was supposed to be carried on the shoulders of Kohathites, out of the tribe of Levi. And it was supposed to be covered in a certain way. There was a whole bunch of specific commands about how it was to be treated.
No. Do you think when it talks about when it went into battle, that the ark actually was under its own power?
No, they carried it. It was being carried
you
by
believe it
a
was
group of
carried.
men, yeah. It was being carried into battle. So like when it carried it into battle against the Philistines, that's what you had. You had some priests, including Eli's 2 sons,
Mm-hmm.
carrying this thing. And of course, then the Philistines just came and killed them. They thought it would protect them. Of course, it didn't.
So the old writings where they talk about it
Floating in the air.
floating in the air under its own power. It was carried by
Yeah,
priests.
it'd be carried by priests. Now, of course, David then follows the proper things. He brings it to Jerusalem, and God blesses that effort. And then David wants to build a temple. And in chapter 7, God, first of all, says, no, you can't. Why can't David build a temple?
He's a man of blood.
He's a man of blood. But yet the blood he shed was legitimate bloodshed. He's not a murderer yet. But he is a violent man. Why would God not want David, but would choose Solomon, a man of peace? And he knows Solomon's going to blow it in the end. So it's not because Solomon is going to always be a spiritual giant. Why would God make this choice? Why does God not want a conquering king to build his temple, but a peaceful king?
As if it came by power. As if it was built by those efforts.
Yeah, it's what kind of God he is. I think it does. It reflects the character of God. And even though God is sovereign, primary characteristic of God that God wants displayed is his mercy. In fact, we've been given a ministry. We've been given a ministry of world conquest. Right? No, it's Islam. Evangelism through conquest. You know, you put a gun to their head and say, repent, because you're about to get sent. No, that's not the way we're supposed to do it. We've been given a ministry of peace and of Paul talks about it. No, of reconciliation, in which we go to the world and say, God is reconciled towards you, now be reconciled towards God. And you know, a ministry of reconciliation is a ministry of peace, a ministry of mercy, and a message of peace and mercy, saying that God wants peace with man. When he wants to show us mercy and pour it out. He wants to pour out forgiveness. Well, you can't have that kind of a message if you're conquering. And I think that's a part of it. That God wanted the world to see him as the creator who loves his creation, not the dominant force who conquers his creation. So the image of God that you see in Islam is the very image that God does not want to have. A God who brings all into subjection to himself. And I think that's a part of the reason why then he chose Solomon to build a temple and not David. But David is a righteous man. Now, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we have the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant. And God honors David and says, you know, even though I won't let you build a temple, I am going to make a covenant with you. And you remember we talked about the 3 parts of that covenant when we talked about the Abrahamic covenant. And what are the 3 parts of the Davidic covenant? An eternal throne, which is house, throne, and that's the house, throne,
Kingdom.
and the kingdom, an eternal, enduring kingdom. Going to have the right to rule, the descendants to do the ruling, and the people to rule. So here in chapter 7, that's what God says. And he says, wrong page. It says, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I'll set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, he did, I will chasten him with the rod of men, he did, Hadad and Jeroboam, and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And here is the covenant. And your house, which is the line of his seed, and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. So it's an eternal kingdom. Now, it didn't mean God couldn't suspend it for a while, which is exactly what happened with the Babylonian captivity up until now. But it does now require God to reestablish it to fulfill his promise if it's going to be eternal. And that has to be done through Jesus Christ. And that's why I'm a premillennialist. That's why I anticipate the kingdom coming back and Jesus physically ruling Israel from Jerusalem on the throne of David in fulfillment of this promise. Because notice, the promise is unconditional, and it's made with the recognition that David's descendants are not going to live up to it. He says, if he sins, I'll discipline him. And David's descendants don't live up to it. But the promise doesn't depend on their faithfulness. It depends on God's faithfulness. And so we anticipate the fulfillment of this because God is faithful, just as we have assurance of our salvation, security in Christ, because God is faithful to his promises, even when we are faithless. He is faithful. Why? Because he cannot deny himself. Paul tells us this in, I think it's Colossians. And so God establishes this covenant with David, at the same time telling him, but you can't build the temple. But I'm pleased that you want to. So David's response then, of course, is to say, well, all right, then I'll just go on and conquer some more people then. No, that's not his response. What does David do the rest of his life?
Gets in trouble.
No, besides that. The good stuff. The good thing. He spends the rest of his life getting ready to build a temple. We learned this in Chronicles. Now, from this point on, he says, okay, well, I can't build it, but I can design it. You know, Solomon's temple was actually designed by David. The architects already had it all drawn up before Solomon came on the scene. David had it all drawn up and planned out. And every time David conquered another city or another country, and he plundered it, all that money went for the temple, into the temple treasury, not his own. And it went so that they could decorate the temple when it was built. And when Solomon goes to put gold on everything, it's because David had been saving it up for 20, 30 years. You know, this was the gold from a lot of different countries. And so David, even though he can't build, he says, but I can get ready to. And so you see the heart of David in this. And Chronicles brings that out even more so. Now, David does then, chapters 8, 9, and 10, go on to military exploits. And he proceeds to defeat all of his enemies all around. And God blesses him. Why does he bless David? And the answer is not because he's under Abrahamic covenant. That worked for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what's the key to the blessing that David experiences? We know this from Deuteronomy. What was the promise in Deuteronomy? Obedience brings blessing. David is obedient, God blesses him. When a king is obedient, the way God blesses is victory. David is having a spiritual influence on the nation. They're experiencing God's blessing. And that blessing in their world is communicated through victory over your enemies.
Now, do you think David will rule in the millennial kingdom?
Yes.
You know the passage in Jeremiah when it says, I will raise up David.
Yeah, well, that one, there's some debate as to whether that's David himself or if that's Jesus as David's descendant. In other words, David, when he says David, he's really referring to his descendant. line of David. But yes, I think David will reign with him. He will reign with God. In fact, we know that Zerubbabel will, because Zerubbabel is promised that when Messiah comes and sets up the kingdom, that he'll be the signet ring on his hand, and that he'll be in charge of the future millennial temple. So Zerubbabel is going to be resurrected and reign with Christ, so it would seem illogical that David wouldn't get to also.
Well, how do they make the argument this is lying?
Because often in the Old Testament, they will refer to, for example, when Israel fought against Amalek. Well, it wasn't Amalek, it was him and his army. You know, so you'll use the king in place of the nation. So instead of saying Babylon, you'd say Nebuchadnezzar. And it was very common to say the house of David. And so that's how they take it, is it may be a reference to the descendant of David using David's name. But that's, again, that's where you're imposing on the text sometimes an outside idea as well.
Because it seems pretty clear.
Yeah,
It's already
it seems to me
David.
it's naming David and saying David's going to do it. But some will take it the other way. So when, you know, if you read the commentaries, you see it go different ways there. But yeah, David will be there, the apostles will be there, the patriarchs will be there, Abraham, Isaac are going to. Moses will finally be there. You know, other than the one time he was there, you know, with Jesus. But yeah, they'll all enjoy it. You and I won't be there. I don't know about y'all. I'll be in Texas. And we'll go back to our native countries. Oh man, there's some great spots out there in West Texas. It's dry and
Yeah, I lived in East Texas for 7 years. It was enough.
yeah, you just have to like different things. Actually, there are parts of Texas that are really nice, but most of it's not.
There are.
And, in fact, I knew someone that when in World War II, he was on a train, and as the sun went down, they entered Texas, and it was all flat, scrubby, boring. He woke up the next morning. The train had been going all night. Looked out the window. They were still in Texas. It was all flat, scrubby, boring. In fact, it was as if they hadn't gone anywhere. And he was going down to San Antonio to be trained. And it was all flat, dry, scrubby. But, you know, in the millennial reign, we are going to reign with Christ. And I think David will be there. And now, you have this interesting thing again. In the context, you have this division of things. Chapter 8, you have the list of all of his military conquests. The Philistines, Moab, Zobah, Damascus, Edom. You know, you just draw a circle. He's whooping everybody around. And then in chapter 10, you have the situation with the Ammonites. That sets up the war that ends up with the sin with Bathsheba. In between, chapter 9, again, you see this because David is establishing his kingdom. Well, in their world, one of the keys to establishing your kingdom is wipe out your competitors. So in the midst of this, in the midst of God's blessing, you have the story of Mephibosheth. David seeks out a descendant of Jonathan in order to keep his promise. And Mephibosheth is Jonathan's heir. And can you imagine how, and the text indicates this by the comment about him coming and bowing to him. Mephibosheth is scared silly. Because again, he's grown up in a world. And in fact, where he's been living is across the Jordan in this little podunk town out in the middle of nowhere. He's basically been hidden away. And they hunt him down. And they bring him to the king. And remember, when you come to see a king in their world, he always has this big bruiser standing next to him. In David's case, it's Joab. Later on, in Solomon's case, it'll be Benaiah. It's the biggest, baddest guy in the country. He's a hitman. And he's his general, he's his friend, he's his bodyguard, and he's his assassin. He's his chief executioner. And when you're brought into the presence of the king, and if you make the king mad, you don't go out in one piece. And that, by the way, that's the context behind the book of Hebrews that says that because Jesus went as our forerunner, we go into the presence of God, to the very holy of holies, with boldness. Now, the term boldness has the idea of calm assurance. That unlike the rest of the world who goes into the presence of a king in fear and trembling, we can go in with full confidence that we're going to come out alive. We go in knowing that we're going to be accepted. We're not going in wondering, am I going to live or die? Why does the king want to see me? We go in and we can go to the throne of mercy and ask for mercy. Implying that we're going in a situation where we need help, whether it's moral help or other kind of help. But we can go with confidence because Christ has gone before us and smoothed the way. But Mephibosheth is brought to him, and David blesses him and treats him as one of his sons. Gives him Saul's possessions. And it's pretty vast wealth. Again, David could have absorbed all that and kept it himself as the new king. But instead, he gives it to Saul's heir, Saul's grandson, and blesses him. So you have that contrast. David does the opposite of what the world says because he gave his word. And politically, it would be a weak move. But his confidence is in God. And so this is similar to that situation now where we had what we talked about last time, the situation between the two times he spares Saul. You have Nabal, and you see that he will kill anybody. But he spares Saul because he's anointed. You have this chiastic structure. Here, I think you have the same thing. He's conquering, but he'll take the time to keep his promise to take care of an heir of Saul's because he's given his word. Now, we move into the next section of 2 Samuel, which is his sin and failure. And in chapter 11, you have the adultery and murder while everybody else is at war. Now, what did Jewish tradition say about this? You told us last week about Uriah, supposedly.
Supposedly Jewish tradition says that Uriah was Goliath's shield bearer. And David made some sort of contact with him and said, when I come against Goliath, if you step aside and let me through, I will protect you and bring you into my kingdom when I'm king. Because at that point he had already been anointed and knew that was going to happen. So, and then ultimately, David gives Uriah Bathsheba as a wife through that. And God had always intended for Bathsheba to be David's wife because ultimately she's in the line of Christ. So we see sort of the detour that is, again, in Jewish tradition is taken because of...
to justify his actions. Yeah.
To justify his actions or to explain God's reason for using Bathsheba in the line of Christ. I mean,
Yeah.
Part of it makes sense.
Yeah. Now, likely none of it's true, but here is the interesting thing. Uriah is a Hittite. The Hittites are one of the Canaanite groups that Israel's supposed to wipe out. We're never told if Uriah is a believer as such, but probably was. Probably worshiped God along with David. What we do know is he's one of the guys who aligned himself with David when David was in exile. He's also one of his mighty men. He's near the bottom of the list, but he was one of the 33 guys that was David's best fighters. You know, he had, 600 soldiers? Well, these were the top 5%. And you know, when you get to that part where he talks about David's mighty men, you had your top 3 who were phenomenal warriors. Then you had your next 3 who were more like Rambo. You know, the top 3 were more like what, the Terminator, I guess. You know, they were unstoppable fighting machines that you know, the one guy stands in the field and kills guys until his hand's so tired he can't let go of, you know, he gets cramps, he can't let go of his sword. Just phenomenal guys. And so, but he's no slouch of a soldier. But he's also, again, a Canaanite. And it's clear that Bathsheba is an Israelite, a godly woman, a wise woman. How do we know that?
Trans Solomon.
Yeah. She taught Solomon. Solomon is what he is because of her. You know, I think a lot of mothers don't understand how significant they are. Now, studies have shown fathers are important. You know, us men need to be godly fathers. We do have a powerful impact in the lives of our sons. But our wives are going to teach them most everything. You know, and a godly mother is a powerful tool in the hand of God. But anyhow, so we have the situation, chapter 11, of course, he commits adultery. What is Bathsheba's status in all this? What kind of a moral evaluation should we take on Bathsheba? Was she wrong to be on the rooftop taking a bath?
Probably not. That's pretty common.
Yeah, that was standard. She's not doing anything unusual. Should she have expected the king to be up there changing his name to Tom? Because he's busy keeping it. No. I mean, her husband's gone off to war. As far as she knows, everybody's gone off to war. So she probably figures there's nobody there. When the king calls for her, why didn't she say, I'm a married woman? No, sir.
He's the king.
Yeah, he's the king. You don't say no to a king. I mean, she doesn't have a choice. You know, my evaluation is she is guiltless in the sense that what happened to her, she didn't have a choice. And in fact, in all the accounts, she's never accused of a sin. She is the true victim of David's lust. And my assessment is this, that she really did love her husband Uriah. And Uriah really did love her.
Well, it's kind of interesting too to notice that Uriah never actually went home to her.
That's right.
So she would have never had an opportunity to come and say, by the way, you know, David got me pregnant.
That's right.
So,
There's no contact between them. I mean, there may have been servants that carried messages or things, but she wouldn't be saying, you know, she notified David, and it's David's problem to solve, and David's trying to, and she may have even tried to cooperate. But Uriah's character is such that he will not go home and enjoy himself when his men are not. And he's doing it out of loyalty to David. And the real irony, of course, is David sends his death sentence in his own hand because David can trust him not to read it. I mean, there are so many ironies in this story.
So, play devil's advocate on her not, her actions. And we have examples of Joseph when he was approached incorrectly by someone of power who he should have complied with, following that logic.
That's right.
We have example of Esther, who approached the king when she wasn't called for, out of protocol, definitely, and praised for it. Both of them praised for it, and I don't know. I think we can look at her example and see that she's not praised for what she does.
That's right. She's not praised for it. Yeah.
And probably take the conclusion that she's not praised for what she does.
Yeah.
Rather than
That's
saying,
a good point. Yeah.
rather than saying she was
She's
bad.
a victim.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she was a victim. Yeah. I think she could have said no. I mean, she knew it was
She knew it was wrong.
wrong.
Yeah. And she sends a message, King, I'm pregnant. Fix it.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's always been my
Yeah.
thing. Is it takes two to tango,
That's right.
even
Yeah.
if one's a king.
Yeah, even if one's king. That's a good point. Yeah. Well said. Now, what are the consequences? Well, we have what follows. Of course, Nathan comes and tells the story and confronts David. And what's David's verdict when he hears the story?
Kill him and pay back fourfold.
Yeah, kill the guy and make him pay back fourfold. And of course then Nathan says, that guy is you. And unlike Saul, how does David handle the situation? He repents. And suspending the Mosaic law, God spares David's life. Because under the Mosaic law, a murderer is to be executed. And God commuted his sentence. But,
What about an adulterer?
an adulterer was to be executed too. So he had twice over.
He had the double sentence there.
Yeah. No plea bargaining there. But God spares his life, but it does cost him 4 sons. This one, Amnon, his eldest, Absalom, his second oldest, and then Adonijah, his third oldest, basically. I think all sons that he liked, loved, dear to him.
Now, does David go on to kill Joab, or does he have him killed?
No, Solomon does it for him.
Solomon does it.
Yeah. Yeah, David never has the strength to kill Joab.
Pretty old then.
Yeah. Now, look, so God forgave David. Psalm 51 is written following this. And that's what David means when he says, take not thy Holy Spirit from me. What he's really saying there in Psalm 51 is not, don't take away your salvation, not, anything like that. But the anointing of the Holy Spirit was the right to rule. And he's saying, do not do to me what you did to Saul. In other words, don't take away the right to rule from me like you did to Saul. And God honored that. God did forgive him. So why did God kill, especially that little boy, innocent little child? Why does he kill that child and the next 3 if he forgave David?
Well, the sins of the father are still visited upon the result of the sin.
Yeah, the result
visited
of it,
upon
yeah.
the next 4 generations.
Yeah. In this case, it's just the next generation.
But that doesn't answer the question,
Doesn't
right?
answer.
At least to my satisfaction. I think it's the answer we always hear.
Yeah.
But why did God kill the innocent child and allow David to live? Could have killed David at that point and still kept his promise.
Yeah.
Because he had a son.
He had other sons already, yeah. The line would continue. But it wouldn't continue through Solomon, because Solomon was not seen. I think that opened the door for Solomon to be the legitimate heir. But he could pick anyone he wanted to, so that doesn't make a difference. I think it was because that child would have been an illegitimate child under the Mosaic law. It's a product of adultery. But also, I think it was, again, this would be the special child from this new wife, and it hurt David more deeply than maybe losing one of the others. But David's sin, even forgiven, still had consequences. And those consequences affected his family, and it's going to affect the rest of his rule. And I think that's one of the points made, is that sin has consequences. And even when God forgives us, he doesn't always exempt us from the consequences. Now, I've seen many times where God has been very patient with someone struggling with sin, and they've avoided the obvious consequences. I've had students that I advised who were involved in sexual immorality prior to marriage. And just the way God works circumstances, they not only did not get any girls pregnant, but they didn't get any diseases. They were really, honestly spared. And they repented, they grew, they matured, they stopped the sin, and they went on to serve the Lord. And they marveled that God had spared them. But I've seen other times another Christian, one time, boom, they got AIDS. It's one of those things where you don't say, well, I'll take my chances. Especially not nowadays. It's very unhealthy. Nowadays, I think they say like 95% of all prostitutes have AIDS. They're HIV positive. I tell people, if you're going to go in and sleep with a prostitute, you're better off playing Russian roulette with a gun. You got a better chance of surviving it. And yet people still stupidly go. But there are consequences, and even though God forgave David, and really it's going to go on to bless him, it's after this that the Messianic line is going to be born. In fact, it's through Bathsheba, of all people, not through Abigail, a godly, wise woman, not through Michal, his first wife, and who would be a part of both royal lines. Not through anyone you would expect, but through Bathsheba, that God chooses to continue the line of blessing. But it doesn't exempt David from those consequences. And in fact, you see it not only in the deaths of these sons, but in his inability to deal with his sons when they have problems. Like when Amnon rapes Tamar. David doesn't step in and discipline him. Why? Well, because David's no better than him. I think that's a part of the problem. But also maybe it's because David was an indulging father. He was not a strong father, not a strong leader in the home. He may have been a great leader in the kingdom, but a weak leader at home.
Well, why don't you think he stopped Michal from having all her idols?
I think he was weak. Again, not a strong leader in the home. And you see that even in the line of blessing, there was still idolatry. Yeah, Solomon does it. In fact, it's really not until Josiah. Josiah is the only king in Israel's history who got rid of the high places and who got rid of all the idols throughout the land. The last good king finally does what David should have done. Which is a fascinating thing. So, we have it. Now, of course, the consequences begin to work themselves out. Chapter 13. You have the situation where Amnon rapes his sister Tamar and is murdered by Absalom. And again, the real irony is what? He could have simply married her if he wanted to. But he's driven by lust. And you see the corruption within David's family. But again, you see the curse on his family being worked out. And God is now disciplining David through his family for his sin, even as he's blessing him. But from that turning point of sin with Bathsheba, things are going wrong in David's kingdom. Now remember, in reality, this is happening over several years. And there are good things. He's still winning battles. He's still conquering other countries. He's still bringing in tribute from other countries that he's already conquered. He's still preparing to build a temple. So there are good things going. But the author focuses on the consequences of that sin. And so you have this. You have a brother murdering his older brother in revenge for the rape of his sister. And by the way, Absalom names one of his daughters after his sister. Because his sister's not going, his sister basically, as it says, lived in Absalom's home and never married because she couldn't, because she'd been raped. So she was no longer a virgin, so she was no longer marriageable. Now, the Mosaic law would have permitted, actually, a brother wasn't supposed to marry a sister. So that was incest. That was already a violation of the Mosaic law, and he should have died for that.
Was Amnon technically her
half brother?
Yeah.
Half brother, different mother, same father. So you have the conflict between mothers here. So under the Mosaic law, it was incest. He was uncovering his father's nakedness. David should have been upset, and yet he doesn't act on it. So you have the situation that follows this then. Joab helps Absalom return, be restored by David. after Absalom's been exiled for a while. David, though, is still upset with him, so he doesn't let him come see him. But Absalom uses this then to begin to build a power base to take over. Because he's still going to avenge his sister, but he's going to have to do it against his father, because his father let his brother get away with it. So you see the hatred that is developed in the family. But also, remember, God had promised David one of the punishments, one of the consequences was not only the death of 4 sons, but that his wives would be raped publicly. What he did in secret would be done in public. And so Absalom begins this strategy, and you have then Absalom's revolt in chapters 15 through 18, where Absalom begins the revolt. He gathers a power base that includes who? Ahithophel.
Well, that's Bathsheba's grandfather, grandfather.
Yeah, he's the wisest man in Israel. David's counselor. In fact, what does it say? His words are as good as the words of God. He's as good as a prophet. And he has others aligned with him. And so, of course, David flees. And Ahithophel's counsel is what? If you're going to really draw the line between you and David, rape his concubines. And he leaves behind 10 concubines, which are legal wives, to take care of the house while he takes the rest of his family with him. And so his son rapes those 10 women. And establishes the fact that there is no turning back. Now, Hushai successfully thwarts Ahithophel's counsel. And Ahithophel gets upset, goes home and hangs himself. Right? Why does he go home and hang himself? You ever wonder about that? Well, the man knows. Again, he's the wisest man. He knows because Absalom hasn't listened to me, he's going to lose. And I'm going to be executed for being a traitor. But if I go ahead and die, my family won't suffer. So he goes, puts his house in order, makes sure his heirs are going to get what they get, and hangs himself. He really knows that it's over. Now, again, it's an interesting story in that David flees. Ziba betrays Mephibosheth. And the text isn't real clear between this and when David returns. But I do think that Ziba betrayed Mephibosheth, that he lied, that he didn't help Mephibosheth come join David, and he would have followed David. He would have stayed with David. But he didn't. He ends up, in the end, losing half his possessions. David divides it up, gives him half, and gives Ziba half. Rewards Ziba because Ziba did help them escape. But it's never 100% clear in the text exactly whether Mephibosheth really was guilty or not. But I think the implication is Ziba betrayed him. And Mephibosheth proved his loyalty to David by not grooming himself as long as David was gone. So he entered into a state of mourning as long as David was in flight. That's really what that means. He took a position of mourning for David. He didn't align himself with Absalom. But both Ziba and Shimei, remember Shimei is the guy that curses David and throws stuff at him? They were both Benjamites aligned with Saul. They all had connections to Saul. Goes back to Saul here. But David is dealing with them. Now, God does thwart Ahithophel's counsel. David does escape. He's able to get organized. The battle is taken on, and of course, David's men win. And we see God working out. Why does this happen? Because God has established David's line, and it's going to go through Solomon, not through Absalom. Absalom is a man of blood. It's going to go through a man of peace who's going to build the temple. And so God is working through these circumstances still to accomplish His purposes, because ultimately God is ruling, not David. He's ruling through David, but God is ruling. But David's having all these difficulties because of the consequences of his sin that he has been forgiven for, but God has not spared him of the consequences, and these are the natural outworkings of what he had done. And so here, as we're working our way through near the end of 2 Samuel, we see then that that sin does have its consequences, but God is still sovereignly preserving David, his king. And he is still ruling through David. Now, David's victory, of course, he goes back and he's helped across the Jordan by Judeans. The Benjamites come, it may be that David gave Ziba half of Saul's possessions because he's seeking to win the Benjamites back, and Ziba will have strong influence. So he's taking care of someone who has a lot of influence with that tribe. But I think more it's he as king rewards Ziba for the help that he gave at a very critical time. Now he shows mercy to Shimei. And I don't think he showed mercy to Shimei because he wanted to win the Benjamites, like some would suggest. I think he showed mercy to Shimei for the same reason, if you remember, if you go back, Saul showed mercy to his opponents the day he beat the Ammonites. And someone said, hey, all these guys who didn't bring your present, let's execute them. Saul said, no, this is a day of victory. This is a day of celebration. It's not a time for executing people. And I think David's doing the same thing. He shows grace at a time of victory. When he's returning, he shows mercy to Shimei. And when Shimei comes and begs for mercy, he spares his life. Because he had every right to execute him for the things that he had done. No one would have questioned David. So David, again, is acting wisely like he did when Saul died. He's acting very wisely in people's presence. Now, it doesn't all work because the people that's bringing them back get into an argument between the Judeans and the rest of the guys. And who gets to help David? And they all want in on it. Why? Because they had all gone with Absalom. They're now wanting to get back in David's good graces. It ends up, of course, with a battle. They end up having a revolt. This guy Sheba rebels. Joab kills Amasa, who David appoints in control instead of Joab. He fires Joab because Joab had killed Absalom. So he finally, after that, he finally fires Joab, appoints someone else to be his general. Joab murders the guy. And David is too weak then to punish Joab. Joab gets his job back. And now, what we have happening here literarily is Joab is a foil to David. Joab reveals all of David's weaknesses. And David is weak. He is as weak as Ishbosheth was. See, Ishbosheth couldn't deal with Abner. David can't deal with Joab. He needs Joab to keep himself in power. And so Joab gets away with stuff, even killing David's favorite son. Against David's direct command. And everybody sees this. So you have that situation. And again, David is not solving it, and it reveals he's weak. Just as, remember, Jonathan was a foil that revealed Saul's weaknesses, Joab is the foil that reveals David's weaknesses. Now, this ends the story of David. It's actually going to really end in 1 Kings. But then we have this appendix at the end of the book of Samuel, where we have these 4 chapters. And one of them is in chapter 21, we have something that I think happened early on in David's reign. And that is this famine that came. was imposed on the nation, and they checked with the prophets, and they're told why, and it was because Saul, in his zeal for God, had tried to wipe out the Gibeonites. You remember who the Gibeonites are? You know, they're the ones who made the treaty with Israel when they came into the Promised Land and deceived them. And so it appears that basically what it is Saul decided, I'm going to kill off some Canaanites. Why not these? They had cities basically in Benjamin's territory. So the Benjamites got more land if they get rid of them. And they're Canaanites. But they had been promised that they would be protected. And that covenant still stood. And so God cursed the nation even after Saul's death for the sins of Saul the king. Again, it's very important who our rulers are. You know, this next election is very important. That's why our vote matters. Yeah. Our vote may not work, but we need to be, since we're given that right by our government, we need to make a statement. We need to vote for righteous leaders. Or for the most righteous choice amongst them. Sometimes
Especially
it's
write-in votes every time.
Yeah, you know, sometimes it's a choice of evils. But we should pursue the greatest righteousness, the greatest moral standings. You know, I find it puzzling, or not puzzling, but fascinating that one of the people that Bush is having to go campaigning for is a congressman who has admitted to having an affair, but he's still trying to get reelected in spite of it. And, you know, because the Republicans want to have the majority, they got to get this guy in if they can. It's a close race, so maybe we can still get the people to overlook his immorality. You know, if I was there, I don't know if I'd be able to vote for the guy, unless the other candidate was even worse. You know, and that could be. I mean, it may be that the other one's even more wicked. You never know. You know, those are difficult things. But there are consequences that come from immoral leaders and wickedness in the leadership. And the consequence for the nation was strong. And God sovereignly was judging the nation. So now, y'all have read the solution, which was, of course, they handed over 7 of Saul's grandsons. Because none of his sons are living. So they gave his grandsons, but Mephibosheth is spared. There's a Mephibosheth in the list, but it's a different Mephibosheth. It's not Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, it's someone else with the same name. But 7 grandsons are handed over, and Mephibosheth is spared because David gave his word, and they are executed, and the drought is lifted by God. I think this would be one of those instances of people being put under the ban. And they are punished for their grandfather's sin. Now, actually, one of them was two of them were sons of a concubine. I guess they would be sons of David, of Saul, but not legitimate sons. They would be not heirs to the throne. And and again, that's an interesting aside of the story in that she stays and protects their bodies and won't let the wild animals eat them. And David finds out about it, gives them a decent burial, and in fact buries them in the family burial, and brings Saul and Jonathan's bones and buries them with their family, which again would be to honor them. Remember, in their world, to be buried with your ancestors was a good thing. So he not only takes away God's wrath by allowing the vengeance requested by the Gibeonites, but then he in turn does a kindness to the victims and shows them mercy in burying them with their relatives. And God blesses that. Now you have following this David's song of deliverance, and then the list of the mighty men. And I love that chapter. You know, the guy that jumped into the pit on a snowy day and fights the lion, and the guy that fights the Egyptian and snatches his spear from him and kills him with it. I mean, these are some tough guys. But these are the men who strengthened David, and these are the reasons why he won the battles. even to the very end. But again, sadly, Uriah is one of those guys. And so when David murders Uriah, he's murdering one of his most loyal and powerful forces in his kingdom in terms of his support. The last chapter has the census.
Why was this such a big sin?
Good
I
question.
mean, he counted his guys.
What did the Mosaic Law say? Because he violated the Mosaic Law when he did this.
He wasn't supposed to number anybody.
That's right. The kings were not allowed to number the men in their country unless God commanded them to, because God was keeping track.
So it's more of an unbelief thing, or I'm the
It's an ego thing, yeah. It's I'm going to see how many troops I have so that I can figure out who I can defeat. And it's taking things into your own hands. And the rule was that God said, you don't count them because I'll take care of you, and I'll provide you enough guys to defend your country. So just trust me. And if I want a census, I'll order the census. And he didn't from the time that they went into the promised land.
70,000 guys.
So,
That's pretty heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, sin has consequences. Sin has consequences. And interestingly enough, Joab didn't count the tribe of Benjamin, and I suspect no one died in that thing. Probably it was from the groups that were counted, and it didn't count the Levites because they weren't supposed to. They weren't fighting men. They were counting soldiers. Is what they're doing. They're basically organizing into troops, because when you did that count, you also organized yourselves into fighting units. And so they weren't supposed to do that. So it's just simply, and I think this too, the punishment that comes, it's on the same caliber as what happened to Moses and Aaron when they struck the rock. You go, well, that was just a little sin. But for the one to whom God has given great privilege, there is great responsibility. And there's a greater accountability. And it's just like it's told to us. What are we told? Don't let many of you become teachers because why?
Greater condemnation.
You have a greater condemnation. We're held more accountable before God. You know, that keeps me awake sometimes. And one of the worst things is when I'm sitting there teaching, and as I'm teaching, I know I'm not living up to what the Word of God is saying. But yet I have an obligation to teach the truth. At the same time, I'm feeling convicted. And I'm going, oh man, am I going to get it on Judgment Day? In front of the bema seat of Jesus. Because he's going to say, hey, listen, you knew the answer. Why didn't you live it? And I've already been taught. And one of the great things about ROTC at Texas A&M and service in the military, I've learned the proper answer. No excuse, sir. Be no excuse. And so I think this is it. David, it brings such a strong consequence because David should have known better. And God had given him victory after victory after victory after victory throughout his reign. There's no indication that he ever lost. So why is he counting his army? See? It's a strong act of unbelief that brings this. Now, but also it's an interesting thing because what is the end result? He buys the Temple Mount. So even in that, God uses it. But this sets the stage, of course, for the continuing story, which we'll see in 1 Kings. But in the meantime, let's take a break.